This morning, you're in need of a fresh start yourself. Maybe there have been some mistakes that you made down life's road, mistakes that took place in the past, but you're still reeling from the consequences. Or maybe they're not necessarily your mistakes. Maybe it's the poor decisions of someone around you, maybe in your family, maybe at work, maybe in your neighborhood. And those mistakes, those poor decisions have had an adverse effect on you. Or maybe you need a fresh start today, not necessarily because of any mistakes, but rather you've just experienced some unfortunate circumstances in your life, just some tragic events, and those things have just depleted you and devastated you and just zapped you of all of your joy, all of your enthusiasm. Or maybe there's some of you here today and you just need a fresh start because you just run a dry spell. I mean, you can't put a handle on it. You don't know exactly why, but you yearn, you thirst, you hunger for those days that you used to laugh. And you want so badly just to smile again, just to hold that joy in your heart that you once had. Listen, if that's you today, I've got good news for you. Just as our video just illustrated, we worship a God that makes things new. He is the God of new beginnings. He is the God of fresh starts. As a matter of fact, in Lamentations chapter 3, the author says, "The faithful love of our Lord, He never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is His faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh each morning." You know, friends, we get a wonderful illustration of this verse in the story that we're reading today. Now, if you're a churchgoer, or even if you're not a churchgoer, in all likelihood, you have heard of the gentleman that we're going to be talking about today. Matter of fact, by the time that we get to the middle of Exodus chapter 2, Moses is already a young man. I mean, he's about 40 years old, and it's easy to say that Moses is living the good life. I mean, he's living the life of royalty. Right now, he is one of Pharaoh's grandsons, and you can just imagine some of the benefits that come with that. I mean, he has power, he has status, he has education, he has wealth, he has popularity. He has everything that a worldly man of that culture would ever want. But there's one thing that he's lacking, one essential quality that he hungers for, and that quality is he's missing his identity. Now, even though he's been raised in Pharaoh's household, he's heard along the way a little bit about his Jewish heritage. He realizes that he is somehow linked to the Hebrews, these slaves that are all over the place. And he has a heart for them. He finds himself at times going down to the construction sites and going out to the fields where all of these Hebrew slaves are, and he just watches them. He watches them like a family member would watch another family member. And he hurts for them, and he yearns for them. He yearns for their fulfillment and their purpose and their peace. And one day as he's down there, he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating on one of these slaves, and he takes matters into his own hands. And in doing so, it causes a lot of trouble for him and a lot of trouble for the people of Israel as well. Matter of fact, at this point, Pharaoh kind of wants to get rid of Moses because of what he's done, and Moses heads for the hills. I mean, he gets out of Dodge. I mean, he's got to get out of Egypt, and he runs, and he runs, and he runs, and he finds himself in the middle of nowhere, in this deserted place called Midian. I mean, it's barely a blip on the map. I mean, he is just out in the wilderness, totally depleted. The prince has literally become a pauper. One can only imagine what Moses is thinking at this point in his life. He's probably living with a lot of regret, just kicking himself for doing that foolish thing in that moment of emotion. And he's sitting there, and he's probably wondering if there's any hope left. Does he have any future whatsoever? And out of the blue, he discovers something amazing. He discovers that God is even in the wilderness. And Moses' life is not over. In fact, God is about to open a brand new chapter in Moses' life. And where there was no hope, suddenly there's a lot of hope, and there's a new beginning and a fresh start. And listen, today, if you've come here and you're depleted, and today you're devastated, and life has taken a toll on you, and you're looking for that new beginning, I just pray that Exodus chapter 2 will give you the hope that you're looking for. I'm going to ask you, if you would, to go ahead and turn to that passage. It's Exodus chapter 2, and we're going to be looking at verses 11 through 25. That's Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 25. We find here that one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. Now, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting, and he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Well, who are you to be ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid, and he thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh, went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up, and he came to their rescue, and he watered their flock. Now when the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "Well, where is he?" he asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat with us." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and the man gave him his daughter Zipporah in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become an alien in a foreign land." During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Folks, what does this passage communicate to us about God's grace in our life, and especially our need for God's grace and our need for him to give us a fresh beginning and a new start? First of all, it tells us this: perfect circumstances do not make us immune to problems or poor decision making. Now, of course, if you know anything about the Bible, you know how Moses got to the place where he was in Pharaoh's household. Now, after the time of Joseph, all of the Israelites, a good many Israelites, had populated Egypt. You remember during the time of Joseph, there was a famine in the land, and all of the people came to Egypt because that was the place where there were resources. And Joseph invited all sorts of people to come to the land of Egypt. And matter of fact, Israelite after Israelite started coming. Matter of fact, over a long period of time, they began to really populate Egypt. Now, when Joseph's time had passed, a new Pharaoh came to reign, and he didn't really know anything about Joseph or the history of the Israelites, and he really began to resent so many Hebrews in the land. Matter of fact, it was his fear that there were so many Israelites in Egypt that they would kind of conquer Egypt over time, and he didn't want that to happen. So what he ended up doing was he issued a terrible, horrible edict. And that was, he wanted all male Hebrew babies killed. Now, you can imagine what these Hebrew mothers thought of that. Moses' mother quickly hid young Moses and hid him as long as she could, but then as Moses got older, she had to do something drastic. You know, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, you know what she did. She makes this little basket, she puts the baby Moses in the basket, and she puts the basket in the reeds among the banks of the Nile. Pretty soon, Pharaoh's daughter comes, and she discovers the little baby, and she adopts Moses as her own son. And that's how Moses got to be in Pharaoh's household. And he grows old, and one can only imagine the perks and benefits that came with being a member of Pharaoh's household. Matter of fact, in Acts 7:22, it says this: Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. You know, knowing what we know about the Egyptian culture at this time, you know, the Egyptian empire, they were leaders in astronomy, in science, in math, in engineering. They were leaders in warfare. They were arguably the most powerful empire at the time. And all of this stuff, all of this knowledge and education, it was passed to Moses. I mean, Moses had everything, and considering the fact that he was also in line to possibly be one of the next pharaohs, I mean, he was living a pretty good life. But here's the thing: despite all of these benefits, Despite all the advantages that he had at life, it still did not keep him from doing something really, really foolish. Matter of fact, if you go back to verse 11 here, it says, "One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were, and he watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." Now, that word for watch, it says that Moses watched the Hebrews at labor. That word watch doesn't just mean that he was looking at them. It doesn't mean that he was just viewing them. The word for watch here is the word yara, and it literally means to watch with emotion. In other words, he was looking at them with his heart. You know, it was tearing him up. It was tearing his soul to see his own people suffering the way that they were. Now, let me ask you this. Is compassion a good thing? Without a doubt, it's a good thing. Moses had compassion for these people. But Moses is a classic illustration, folks, of just because you have a godly characteristic, such as compassion, that doesn't mean that you always use it in the right light. Sometimes you can take something as godly as compassion and misuse it and misdirect it. Kind of like a Christian that has compassion on the unborn, so he goes and burns down an abortion clinic. Here Moses does this. He takes this compassion that he has and he misuses it. He kills this Egyptian taskmaster. Matter of fact, if you look in verse 11, it says, "He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." Now, understand that in Hebrew, the word for beating in verse 11 is the same word used for killing in verse 12. So in all likelihood, this Egyptian taskmaster is actually killing the Hebrew slave. He's beating the Hebrew slave to death. Moses feels like he has to do something. The text says here that glancing this way and glancing that way and seeing no one. Now, commentators sometimes come to Moses' defense here. And how they interpret that verse to mean is that not that Moses was doing anything devious, not like he was trying to hide his sin, but rather he was looking for help. You know, he was looking for help in this direction and glancing in this direction and seeing no one seeing that there was no one there to help, he took matters into his own hands. Now, listen, whether you believe that interpretation or not, here's the deal. It's still a moot issue because murder is wrong regardless of how you try to justify it. But also consider this, folks. Not only was it wrong, man, it was unnecessary. Remember who Moses is. According to Acts 7, this guy has power. He has status. He has privilege. If anything, he could have at some point used his status to diplomatically, perhaps, free the slaves, or at least ease their suffering. You know, Acts 7:25 tells us this. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. We get a glimpse at what Moses was thinking at that moment that he killed the slave. According to Acts 7:25, Moses was thinking, if I kill this man, the people of Israel will see me as kind of their leader. They will see me as kind of a freedom fighter, and it'll start a revolt, it'll start a rebellion, and the people will follow my leadership straight out of Egypt. And none of it happened the way that Moses anticipated. But you know, isn't that life, folks? Life seldom works out the way that we anticipate it to, especially when we're engaged in sin and apart from God's will. Nothing happens according to the way that Moses thought that it was going to work out. The simple fact was, God had not yet put his hand on Moses to be the deliverer. Not yet. I mean, God had no intentions at this point of Moses becoming a leader in raising rebellion. And he certainly didn't anticipate Moses murdering anyone. You know, God would smite the Egyptians in his own way, in his own timing. That was God's business, and the time had not come yet. By rushing God's plan, what does Moses do? He creates a lot of headache and a lot of heartache, not only for himself, but the people of Israel. Folks, the bottom line is simply this. Good intentions are no substitute for God's intentions. If you really want to please God with your life, you lead an obedient lifestyle. You strive to follow God's will. But getting back to the text here, here's the big picture. When does all of this occur? It occurs when the circumstances are absolutely perfect for an Egyptian man. He commits this error in the most ideal of circumstances. Sometimes we get it in our head, if I just had X amount of dollars, or if I had, a better job or a better education or maybe even a better spouse, if I had, a bigger house, I would somehow transcend all of the common problems to modern man. If I just had a little bit more, my life would be so much easier and my life would be so problem-free. The problem with that mentality, folks, is where in human history has that ever taken place? Most of the time, while certainly a little bit more money might make our life a little bit more comfortable, the simple fact of the matter is what you're doing basically is trading one set of problems for another set of problems. Regardless of what stage of life we're in, regardless of how affluent we are, the simple fact of the matter is that we live in a broken world. Walt Disney was arguably one of the most successful businessmen of the 20th century. But listen to what Walt Disney says about this. He says, as far as I can remember, being a celebrity had never helped me make a good picture, or commanded the obedience of my daughter, or impressed my wife. It doesn't even seem to help to keep the fleas off our dog. And if being a celebrity won't give one advantage over a couple of fleas, then I guess there can't be much in being a celebrity after all. What's he telling us, folks? What he's telling us here is the truth that we find in Exodus chapter 2. He's saying, despite my fame and despite my fortune, I still have to live life on life's terms. And one of life's terms is, to quote Jesus, in this world you are going to have trouble. And the reason because of that is because we live in a sin-filled, broken world, folks. A world full of sinners. And we have to include ourselves among that number. And sometimes we are going to run into trouble. Sometimes it's trouble of our own doing. Sometimes it's trouble not of our doing. Sometimes we just run into stuff because we live in an imperfect world. And when that happens, sometimes life takes us to a place of want and need in our life. A place where we experience a famine, whether it be a spiritual famine or a financial famine or a creative drought, a wilderness type of experience. But here's the good news. Even when we experience those times in life, with God, wilderness experiences are never wasted. Even though at times we do have to experience trouble in life, what does Jesus say? But be of good cheer, because I have overcome the world. Even with those type of experiences, we have a God that is even in those places. Now, we find here that Pharaoh, he wants to kill Moses because Moses has done something very taboo in their culture, and I'm not talking about murder. He has taken up for a Hebrew slave, and that was totally a no-no to Pharaoh. In Egyptian culture, slaves, they were like pack animals. They were literally the walking dead, or considered the walking dead. They had no status whatsoever. To the Egyptian, they were the superior class, and they had no association with Hebrew slaves. Seeing here that Moses is taking up for a slave and actually kills an Egyptian, that's got to stop. And therefore, Pharaoh tries to kill Moses. If you look in verse 15, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flocks. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. Although things are not right in Moses' world at this moment, Moses discovers that God is right there. And matter of fact, he finds that God is actually still working in his life. Psalms 34:18 tells us this, folks. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and save those who are crushed in spirit. Today, if you're brokenhearted, Today, if you're crushed in spirit, let me assure you of this. God is a lot closer than what you think. He is close to the brokenhearted. He saves those that are crushed in spirit. Right now, if you're dealing with something in your life, rest assured, God knows who you are. He knows what you're going through, and He is right near you. And He's working. In fact, we find God working in Moses' life in the wilderness. Now, when these daughters of Reuel, this Midianite priest, when they become harassed by these shepherds, Moses comes to their rescue. Matter of fact, it's the very first time that he actually acts like a deliverer. In fact, it's the first time he actually acts like a servant, because once he runs off these unruly shepherds, he begins to water their flocks. We just sense here that God is doing something in Moses' life. He's teaching him about servanthood. He's also teaching him other lessons as well. It's in the desert that Moses will learn the topography of the land. He'll learn all of the sites and all of the places that he needs to become familiar with. He'll certainly get to know where Mount Sinai is. He'll learn how to find water. He'll learn how to find food in the desert. It's in the desert that he will learn how to be a shepherd. All of these things God will use later on in Moses' life. But there's one very special lesson that Moses is going to learn in the wilderness. It seems that these daughters that he rescues, they are the daughters of a Midianite priest. Now, folks, that is extremely significant. Obviously, they were descendants of Midian. Now, who in the world was Midian? If you look in the Old Testament, you will find that Midian was one of the sons of Abraham. He was the son of Abraham and Keturah. Now, seeing that Reuel, who is a descendant of Midian, is a Midianite priest, tells us what? It tells us that Reuel and his family are God followers. In other words, Abraham taught his sons very, very well. He taught his sons the ways of God. His sons, in turn, taught their children the ways of God. The children taught their children the ways of God, and on down through the family line till you get to Reuel. And now Reuel is inviting Moses to be part of his family. Here's my question. Is all of this a fluke? I mean, does Moses just kind of stumble into Midian and just kind of stumble into this family? Or do you see the hand of God here? Folks, I truly believe that all of this is within God's will. God is using all aspects of Moses' life, the good, the bad, the ugly, the great decisions, the poor decisions, the horrible things that he has done. And through his grace, he is using all of it to develop Moses into the deliverer that he one day will become. It's while in Midian, in Reuel's family, that Moses will learn about his Hebrew culture. It is in Reuel's family that he will learn the ways of God. And it's in that family that Reuel and the rest of the family will teach Moses about the faithfulness of God. Matter of fact, if you look here, you will find that Moses here, he joins good company, a long line of Hebrew men that God empowered. Where? In the wilderness of all places. For instance, we know in Genesis 28, it was in the wilderness that Jacob saw the stairway to heaven. We also know that it was in the wilderness that Elijah heard the still small voice of God. We know that it was in the wilderness that John the Baptist preached repentance. We know it was in the wilderness that Jesus won his first victory over the devil. We know it was in the wilderness that Paul received revelations from Jesus Christ. In coming to Midian, folks, Moses hasn't left home. Moses has come home. Matter of fact, he later exclaims in verse 22, I have become an alien in a foreign land. Now understand this. When he talks about being an alien in a foreign land, he's not talking about Midian. He's talking about Egypt. Matter of fact, the ESV, the English Standard Version, actually has a better translation of this verse. In the ESV, it's translated like this: I have become a sojourner in a foreign land. Translation, what Moses is saying, I am finally where I need to be. For the longest time, I have searched for my identity. For the longest time, when I was in Egypt, I just felt like a square peg in a round hole. I just felt like I didn't fit. And I found myself looking at the Israelites and yearning to be with them. And now I get it, Lord. I get it. I am now finally where I need to be. And where did it happen, folks? It happened in the wilderness. Folks, whatever you're going through today, whether it's a hard time, whether it's a rough time, whether it's a wilderness type of experience where you're experiencing some type of famine or drought in your life, understand God is still there and He's still working. The wilderness is not such a bad place to be if it gets your priorities straight and gets you back together with your God. You know, back in 2007, Lake Okeechobee in Florida, which is, the nation's second largest lake. Back in 2007, it experienced a horrible drought. Do you remember that? Remember reading about that in the paper? I mean, it was terrible. In some parts of the lake, the water had receded a mile or more. I mean, docks were all over the place, just empty of any water whatsoever. You find these dry, empty patches of lake bed everywhere. I mean, it was rough on the locals. It was rough on the tourists. It was rough on the wildlife. I mean, it was just a bad thing. But when the waters receded, leaving all of this dry land, archaeologists were amazed to find hidden treasures right there in the lake. They found Native American artifacts, some dating 500 years or more. Ancient arrowheads and shards of pottery. They found Indian jewelry. They found a fishing trawler from 1904 that was sunk during the hurricane of 28. And they found remnants of paddle boats. 19th century modes of transportation. And all of it was there, just below the surface of the water, waiting to be discovered. And the only way that it was discovered, folks, was through a drought. Was through a dry spell. When we experience droughts in our life, God does the same things with us. Sometimes it's when we encounter a famine in our life that we discover a few things, not only about God, but about ourselves. Sometimes we discover a faith that we never realized that we had. Sometimes we discover an inner strength that we never thought that we possessed. And we discover the faithfulness of our God in the process. Nevertheless, folks, we discover that even in our wilderness experiences, God is there, and He's working, and He hasn't gone anywhere. Which really leads us to the very last point before we close. And it's simply this: God always remembers us and raises help at the right time. Matter of fact, if you go to verse 23, listen to what the author says here. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and He remembered His covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. I love that term. It says that God remembered His covenant. Anytime that it says that God remembered, it's not like the English version of how we know that word. It's not as if God somehow forgot about His people and forgot about His promises. It's not like God's up in heaven going, I know I need to be remembering something. What was it? I know. It's the people of Israel. I totally forgot about those guys. Wow, how long has it been? 500 years? I need to go check on them. No, that's not what remembered means in the Bible. When it says that God remembered His covenant, basically what it means, folks, it means God taking the next decisive step in the fulfillment of His promises. Matter of fact, if you took verse 25 and you translated it literally, it reads, God saw the people of Israel and He knew. And He knew. In other words, He knew about their plight. He knew about their suffering. He knew about their circumstances. It never got off of God's radar. And furthermore, He knew the promises that He made to deliver them. All of these things were lining up in God's perfect timetable. Everything was coming together in God's perfect timing. And now was the time to raise the deliverer. You know, someone once said Moses was 40 years in Egypt learning something, 40 years in the desert learning to be nothing, and 40 years in the wilderness proving God to be everything. Nevertheless, folks, as Ecclesiastes 3 reminds us, God has a perfect time, reason, and season for everything in your life. And God is working in your life even when you can't visibly experience Him. When you feel like you're abandoned, when you feel like no one's around. We can't rely on our emotions because our emotions are fickle. They're coming from a sinful individual. One thing that the Bible tells us is that God will never leave or forsake His people. You know, back around 1992, my father was working at Charleston Naval Shipyard. And it was shortly after the Gulf War. You remember the first Gulf War, the Operation Desert Storm, as they called it? You know, our American soldiers, they went into Kuwait, they freed Kuwait. And when that war ended in 1991, there was a huge victory parade in one of our cities. It was either D.C. or New York. But my father was there, and he said that during this parade, of course, all the branches of the military were present. I mean, you had everyone there. I mean, you had, you know, the Marines, the Army, the Air Force, and of course the Navy was there as well. And as the Navy was coming down the processional line, of course, all the different divisions of the Navy were present. You know, you had the Navy pilots, you had the crews of the aircraft carriers and the missile destroyers, and just everyone that was involved in Operation Desert Storm. And at the very tail end were the submariners. And as the submarine crews made their way down the processional, there was a woman in the stands, and she expressed her disgust. She said, "I cannot believe the Navy has the audacity to bring submarine crews to this parade. Everybody knows that there were no submarines in Operation Desert Storm." A Navy admiral happened to be very close by, and he overheard the woman's remark. And as cool as calmly as he could say it without blowing his stack, he turns to the woman and says, "My dear madam, you may not think that submarines were not present at Operation Desert Storm, but I assure you they were there. And with one simple command, our submarine fleet could bring more firepower into that array than all of this military combined. Just because you didn't see them didn't mean they weren't there." Folks, we can say the very same thing about our God. Just because you can't always visibly see Him does not mean that He is not working in your life, folks. Matter of fact, we find in Psalms 34:15, "The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and His ears are attentive to their crying." That psalm tells us two great things about our God. First of all, that psalm tells us that our God is always watching us. We are always in His view. He never turns His back on us. And furthermore, it tells us that His ears are attentive to our crying. Everything that you have ever prayed to your God, every tear that was shed, I assure you, God has seen it, and He understands what you're going through. And in His perfect timing, when He so wills it, He will raise the necessary resources you need to get through what you're going through. You know, the great Charles Spurgeon once said this as we close. He says, "We can't always trace God's hand, but we can always trust God's heart." So friends, whatever it is that you're going through this morning, you know, today, if you've hit a slump, if you're looking for a revival in your heart, keep the faith, keep praying, keep looking above, because not only do we have a God that remembers us, we have a God that will revive us. A God that will revive us through His resurrection power to create in us a new heart and make us into the righteous people He knows we can be. Would you pray with me?